This is the Dissing My Ability podcast. I am your host, Ken Meeker, certified professional coach and owner of Vitality Career Coaching. I am pleased to introduce my guest this week, Stephen Beard, who is a realtor out in California, and he is bringing something to this show that I'm very excited to engage in a conversation about. Without further ado, welcome, Stephen Beard.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be able to talk to you, Ken.
Likewise. If you're comfortable disclosing a little bit about yourself, how your personal journey with disability brought you to where you are today, and how it might affect your day-to-day living. Of course, whatever you disclose is up to you, but just so people out there listening kind of have an understanding of what you encounter and what your lived experiences is with disability on a day-to-day experience.
Sure, of course. So I am a person with cerebral palsy, and it impacts my walking, balance. Primarily, I walk with a pronounced gait, and this has been my reality my whole life. And when I decided to start to get into real estate about 18 and a half years ago, I wanted to be the real estate agent for people with disabilities in my area. And so that became my niche, my specialty. And over the years, I've learned that when I originally started, I was naive about it. I was not a disability advocate at that time. I didn't know a lot about different types of disabilities, except at a very, very high level. And so I've learned that everybody's circumstances are unique. And sometimes some of my best clients over the years have people who did not manifest a physical challenge in their day to day or in their housing needs. So it's been a great joy for me to work with the community of people that I've come to know and serve over all these years, and to really embrace a part of me that had been really suppressed earlier in my life. Really begin to make a difference, I think, in helping people to look at the ultimate in independent living. I do a lot of work in the disability advocacy in the IDD community, intellectual and developmental disabilities communities. And many of the folks who have housing needs in that community have neither the financial means nor the adequate supports to live as independently as they would like. And so I have a solution as a realtor who is providing a customized service to them. And I am now, through all my advocacy, connected with all kinds of advocates offering all kinds of housing options, and thus I can be more helpful, even more helpful than before. So yeah, that's what I
That's
do.
which is I think is absolutely incredible, and the challenges that we can face, in trying to find adequate and appropriate and accessible housing when we live with a disability. It's something so incredibly important. As you and I have discussed. I mentioned earlier, I had an aunt growing up who was in a wheelchair her whole life, and they always had to customize their homes just so she could get, to the bathroom and through the doors and all of that kind of stuff. And it's one of those things that most people don't think of unless it's an experience that they have to go through. Is this something that's accessible for anybody, for somebody in a wheelchair, for all different types of things? And so what you're doing is critically important, I think. 18 years ago I think is what you said, how long you've been doing real estate. Why real estate?
So I kind of fell into real estate. I had been working in other professions. I had done a stint in software customer service, and I was a journalist for a while, a radio journalist for a while, and I had been a project manager. But due to a variety of circumstances, I needed to make a change. And I had a brother-in-law who was a real estate agent, and he suggested I consider getting my real estate license. And I was kind of hesitant at first because of the perception I had of real estate agents and this idea of not wanting to become salesy, not wanting to become one of these types of high pressure people. And
Yeah.
it was a very pleasant realization that I came to, that I would be able to do this work with integrity. I would be able to do this work in a way that I wasn't constantly pushing people to do what I wanted them to do, but helping them to make good decisions about where they wanted to live and what they wanted to do with their lives. And so that's why it's been incredibly rewarding. I've never done any line of work more longer than this. And I love it because of that. I love it because of the hours. I control my time more than I ever did when I was working for someone else, obviously. And I get to make a difference in my own way, as I talked about before.
Yeah.
There's a joy you get when you help someone buy a home who never thought they ever would be able to afford to buy a home or find something that would work for them and their family. And you give them the keys. I mean, it's very special.
Yeah. I can imagine that moment is incredibly rewarding. But somebody else being able to experience that, oh, wait, I don't have to live like that. And one thing you mentioned is you were naive at first about disability and
Yeah,
within real estate. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
absolutely. Yeah, when I started in real estate, I with my initial advertising material, my initial promotional material talked about helping people who had physical challenges. But I quickly pivoted and learned that I could help folks who had cognitive challenges. I could have folks who had invisible disabilities. I could make a difference for the quote unquote differently abled as effectively as I could help someone who was using a wheelchair. And so that's what I meant by that. I didn't realize how broad a community. I did not realize that nearly 20% of Americans identify as having a disability. I
Yeah.
had no idea the numbers were that high when I started, and that's what I meant. It's been a great joy, for example, to help someone on the autism spectrum, high-end functioning autistic, to buy a condo, perhaps with the help of family, but to actually have their own place that they own, even though they themselves don't have any sort of physical restriction on their movement, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Because
I've
it's a
helped
big
folks
community.
with yeah, I've helped folks with MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity. I've certainly helped my share of folks who are blind or visually impaired. I've helped my share of folks who are deaf and hard of hearing. So it's a broad spectrum. And, one of the things that I did want to mention is that in the last 2 years, almost 2 years, I've been able to give back in another way. So what I've been doing, my passion project really over the past year and a half is a podcast of my own that I do, which is all about accessibility and housing. And that's allowed me to be such a better real estate agent because now I'm meeting people all over the country, not just in my area, who have something to say about housing
Yeah,
and a disability or accessibility. And it's been amazing what I've learned about, some of the big trends going on right now in how do we adequately house people who are differently abled,
yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
been
It's a
great.
great podcast. I've listened to it.
Oh,
I
thank you.
subscribe to it. Um, hopefully to be able to get on there as a guest one of these days and bring something to the
Absolutely,
table.
Ken. We'll
But
do that.
then glad so glad you mentioned it because it is a phenomenal podcast. And
Well,
it's very broad. Well, and it's broad in its appeal.
thank you.
It's not pigeonholed towards any like. Well, if you're only somebody that's living with a disability, it's not just for those people. It's for anybody that knows anybody that has a disability and just helps them, similar to like what I'm trying to do with this podcast, open up the world to like this is what other people's lived experiences is, and this is what some people have to go through on a just to make it through life, and it creates that awareness that you know what, accessible housing matters.
Yeah.
It really does matter.
You know, there is a lot of improvement that we've seen in the past 20 years around thinking about access in building housing, especially government money where government money is involved. But we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go in terms of educating people about some of the things to think about. Like I did a show about 3 months ago, maybe longer, where I talked to a climate change researcher who shared all kinds of stories about how housing for people with disabilities or differently able people is really going to be impacted in its own unique way and in some ways worse than the general public when it comes to climate change. And I just thought that was a really interesting thought because we think about climate change affecting people's ability to live on coastal
Yeah.
lowlands, right? But how many people have thought about how climate change impacts people, the housing of people with disabilities?
Yeah.
So that's a kind of I love doing stories that sort of take a new angle. I like to call my show the intersection of accessibility and housing.
Yeah.
So I try to get a very broad perspective. So I appreciate that you noticed that. Thank you.
Yeah, because I think it's really important because, I've had this conversation with a lot of people in terms of disability and inclusion. The disability aspect of it when it comes to diversity, unfortunately, sometimes is an afterthought. In order for
Yes.
something to be really inclusive, as it applies to people living with with disability, it it can't be an afterthought in order to truly create inclusion and true access. It has to be something that is thought of at the initial design phase, at the engineering phase, when something is being first developed. In order for it to truly be accessible, for it truly to be inclusive, it has to be something that's built into the design. And I'm glad that, having that conversation with a climate change scientist, it creates that awareness that accessible housing for people that are differently abled can't be an afterthought. It needs to be something that goes into the initial phases of something because that's what truly makes it something that where everybody's thought about.
And you're absolutely right, Ken. And I've had the opportunity to speak to some architects and developers who are very in tune with this idea. It, of course, is not universal, but there's a movement towards universal design standards in architecture and in design that would make the thinking at the outset of projects, housing projects of all types, be more akin to the way we now think about green standards for housing,
Mhm.
and make it much more part of the initial thinking. And that will lead to better outcomes across the board, regardless of the modality of the housing. So
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. And if I, with this podcast, can just make a few more connections, I really just, I'm not making any money from the podcast. It's just a fun, sort of a fun project and a passion project. It is something, but one of the reasons I started is so that I could connect people. And one of the greatest joys I've had since I started the podcast is hearing about or facilitating the connection of individuals from different parts of the country who are working on things where they can collaborate and end up with a 1 + 1 = 3 sort of scenario. That's kind of joyous to me too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is, I mean, not all rewards are financial. I tell people that
Absolutely.
all the time. Not everything has to be about making a buck. The universe doesn't care about how much money you have.
You're
It
absolutely
doesn't
right.
it doesn't care. We have to look out for each other, otherwise we're never going to get anywhere. And so with regard to like I live in Phoenix, Arizona, which is crazy, crazy hot. And so some of there's regional demands on accessibility. You're in California, there's regional demands there, and California is also crazy expensive. What are some of the current challenges, like with today's housing market, which is just insane, that you're encountering with people that they're facing that are the sort of the greatest challenges with access to housing right now?
So I would preface my answer. I work in a very built up part of the Bay Area of California. It's a very urbanized, it's an older housing stock. Much of the housing stock here is 100 years old or more. There isn't a lot of new land to build on or to build housing on. And when they do, they tend to build up
Yeah,
multi-unit condos or multi-unit apartments. So what I'm about to say may not be relevant for someone living in the Midwest or in a rural area or something like that. So
of course.
with that said, the biggest challenge still remains affordability. Now, back in in the recession, I worked through the 2008, 9, 10, 11 recession. And during that time, the affordability crisis got lightened up because prices fell a lot and there were lots of programs to help buyers with down payment. But from about 2013 until this year, there really hasn't been much for buyers to turn to be able to write competitive offers and get them accepted by sellers in the purchase market to help with affordability. That's changing, and federal and state money is being made available for down payment assistance and other programs to help buyers with affordability, including buyers with disabilities, self-identified or authenticated. The Bay Area, where I work, still is one of the most expensive places to live in the country, despite the market softening a little bit in the fall of 2022, which is where we're at. But despite that, affordability is the number one problem. The second problem, close behind, but not as big, is the lack of adequate, accessible resale housing stock. Because as I said, they're not building a ton of new housing. And so if you want a single family home where I am, maybe 1 in 100 homes will have been modified to some degree to support someone with a physical limitation. But we still have a market dominated by older homes with poor design, inadequate hallway width, inadequate open space, inadequate doorway widths.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. I saw a house once where the bathroom was huge, but the door to get in it was only 27 inches. It's like,
I believe
it's
it.
weird.
I totally believe it.
So that's the second, I would say the second biggest problem is that we just don't have housing stock. So what that means is the buyers need to find money to find a home that they can modify and then have the money to modify it. And some of the local municipalities and agencies around here offer grants and loan programs to help finance such things, but such programs are income limited. And so they quickly become unusable by the vast majority of clients that I serve who have enough money to qualify for a mortgage loan, but don't have enough money to qualify for the $30,000 in assistance they would get from the state or the local city to do, say, a ramp at the front of the house, whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah,
So, so that's a problem,
yeah.
right?
I think that's, and it's probably more, certain aspects of it are probably more pronounced in the Bay Area just because of the age of the communities. But I think it's pretty universal, especially with regard to cost. I know here in the Phoenix area, it's gone crazy with, prices
Oh
and
yeah,
rents and everything. And it just exacerbates it, for people that
and
have that are in the lower end of this income scale,
yeah,
because it's like,
yeah.
how do you access things when prices are just astronomical, even with rents? So what are some of how do you help with those challenges when somebody's like, I have enough for a down payment on a house. Let's say they're a first time home buyer. I'll give you a scenario. Let's say they're a first time home buyer. They have enough for a down payment and they qualify for whatever the, median housing price is there in the Bay Area, but they're having difficulty finding like a house that suits their needs based on, what their income and what they qualify for. How do you sort of navigate that?
So because I work mostly in the resale world, the housing stock is what the housing stock is.
Yeah.
So I will help the client to isolate and find properties that meet their basic criteria, and then help them to evaluate the home's accessibility for their unique accessibility needs. No two clients I've ever had have had the same accessibility needs, even if
Oh, yeah.
it would appear visually that they do. It's certainly not true.
Yeah.
So having done some sort of needs assessment with them to determine how they're going to use the space they live in from an accessibility perspective, I then am helping them to find properties that are close enough that we can find a way to make it work, or find a resource to get them over the finish line if they can't find exactly what they want. And in some cases they can't afford to do it, so they have to look at living somewhere else or continuing to rent, right?
Yeah.
So it's not always going to work out, but that's what we work towards. So we will work with our lender partners around the financing piece. We will work with the buyer to make sure that we're able to help them to evaluate these properties. For some of our clients, we'll preview the homes for them before they go to see them
Yeah.
to verify their accessibility, because transportation can be a real challenge for someone who is significantly mobility challenged. Um, Getting paratransit or another way of getting to and from places. I've had clients before who were non-ambulatory, and so to show them a house that could work, save for a couple of front porch steps, required assistants who could actually lift them out of the wheelchair and allow them to access the main level and then help them get back in the wheelchair. I've actually had clients like that. I
Yeah.
sold a home several years ago where I had a lady who uses a wheelchair, and she lives very independently. She's a younger lady and she's very independent, and she would actually exit her wheelchair and sort of drag herself up the stairs. She had cerebral palsy, has drag herself up the stairs and then crawl around the house on the inside.
Oh
And
my
that would work.
gosh.
That worked for her to evaluate the property.
Yeah.
It's
I
very
mean, that
interesting.
it's so really what it is really meeting the clients where they are, and
Exactly.
instead
Yes.
of just like, which is so important. And I wish more people, thought about that, access is more than just being able to navigate, but getting to and getting upstairs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That is part of access. It's so much broader than a lot of people think. And I'm, thank you
Yeah. So,
for
and that's
thinking of it from a 360 point of view. Like, how do they get there? All of that matters,
yeah.
and it's so
And
important.
and how are they going to live in the community after they move there?
Yeah,
How accessible are the sidewalks, the roadways, access to amenities that they need, access to services that they are used to getting in their apartment or where they live at home with their family? The community supports vary dramatically by neighborhood and by individual circumstance and individual need, right?
yeah,
So one of the things that I want to look at is if I have someone who is receiving a certain series of services in their home, maybe supported housing services or in-home support of some nature. How are they going to continue to obtain those things in the new environment? And what are the possibilities for how that will look? And most of them appreciate my sensitivity to this because your typical real estate agent, and I'm not trying to be, I want to be clear here. Real estate agents, I know a lot of amazing real estate agents, but most of them, 95% of them, do not really know about the care system, whatever it is in their state, and how people are living in their homes, and
yeah.
might not know to ask the right questions around how you're going to use the space you're going to move to from an accessibility and a livability point of view as a person who is differently abled, right?
Yeah, I think that's I think that, that's not a knock towards anybody. It's just an accurate statement. It's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. And,
That's very true.
yours and our lived experience is, we've had to learn to understand certain things that people that don't have a disability, they won't have to understand because they don't experience it. And so it's not that I'm a big proponent. It's not that people don't care. It's just they don't know. And so,
Exactly. Yeah. I always admire other real estate agents who reach out to me and ask me how some things they should be thinking about to serve their clients. It happens from time to time because I've established this unique niche. Some other agents have learned about it, and they will often turn to me to help their clients.
yeah, I
So,
I think what you're doing is it's so important. Creating awareness is one of the best ways, I think, to create advocacy. Is people don't know what they don't know, and until they know, they can't be an ally. They can't help to advocate and create more better access for all of us, because we all benefit from greater accessibility. We're all eventually going to get older, and a lot of the things that elderly people need in terms of accessibility for their homes are things that also help people that are living with disabilities. Like
yes.
hold bars in a shower. As somebody with a visual impairment, it's critical important for me just to figure out where I
Oh
am
my
in a
God.
shower.
It just seems like common sense, doesn't it?
It does, but common sense
Yeah.
is neither common nor sense. I've learned
Yeah.
that.
You're
So
absolutely right.
And so I want to circle back to one last thing that I wanted to touch on, and it's something that what you put is accepting ourselves and our limitations is important, and that you've learned that it's okay to ask for help. And those two sentences, I think, are critical for just in life in general, but especially important if you are somebody who's living with a disability, that asking for help is a strength. It's not a weakness. And the more we can get comfortable asking for help when we need it and knowing who to ask for help that can help us is we all have limitations in life, right? You know, I'm never going to be a basketball star and it has nothing to do with my sight. It's just something I'm never going to be able to do. And that's, we all have limitations and we all have to ask for help. And so I thank you for, pointing that out because I think that that's critically important. So I'm hoping you can elaborate on, what kind of made you step into that space where asking for help is a good thing, not a bad thing.
I've come to learn as I've gotten a little bit older that many, many, many people clutch their independence, your physical independence in this reality, in this world, like a pearl. And it is extremely damaging to the ego, if I may use Freudian terms here.
Sure, why not?
It's extremely damaging to our sense of self when we begin to see that independent ability go away. So, for those of us who see that happening to ourselves, we have to kind of get over ourselves
Yeah,
and take the ego out of the picture and be a little bit humble and not feel that it is somehow demeaning or lessens ourselves to ask for help. And I have to admit, it's been a hard lesson for me to learn as my mobility has decreased. And I'm still walking, and I hope that I am still that I'm able to enhance this perspective if my limitations, physically limitations, go get more pronounced. But I think that the power is in avoiding the ego play and
yeah,
being able to look at our needs from a practical perspective. And there's no shame in it.
yeah.
And I think that's another aspect of it. There's a kind of an embarrassment when you can't take care of yourself if you're used to have always being able to
Hmm.
take care of yourself.
Hmm.
So there's a certain group of people with disabling conditions or limiting conditions who have had them for their whole lives. So they might not have the same emotions as someone who has always had some ability and now doesn't have it anymore, or it's not working as well as it did.
Yeah,
And
they
we see
feel
this in
less
all
than.
aspects of life, right? Not
Yeah.
just in terms of people losing ability, but you know, people get embarrassed that they have to put on their new glasses to see distance versus
Hmm.
seeing local.
Hmm.
Like it's not specifically tied to the quote unquote disability world. We all feel that way, or many of us feel that way when we can't do things we used to do before, you know?
Yeah. Well, thank
And
you
I
for
think
pointing that
that,
out.
yeah, but it's not, there's no shame because it's just being human.
Hmm.
Quite all right to have a human experience, right? It
Absolutely.
doesn't make you lesser or greater. It just is.
Yeah.
And your self-worth and ego should not be tied to whether or not you can bend down and tie your shoelaces, or whether or not you have to wear special glasses, or whether or not you need a hearing aid, or whether or not you need to use a cane or a walker or a wheelchair, or any of those things. It should be intrinsic to the other gifts and values that you bring. And
Yeah.
we all have gifts and values we bring, even if we don't think so, that have nothing to do with how we manifest physically in this space. So that's why.
That was awesome. That was fabulous. So I think that is the perfect place to end it is on that note because you summed that up so eloquently and so accurately.
Thank you.
I could not definitely add anything to that because you summarized that perfect. Thank you. Where can people find you if they want to reach out to you or learn more about your podcast, learn more about you, or if somebody has a housing question, or where can people find you?
So people can find me at a number of places. Just Google my name, Stephen Beard, Realtor or real estate agent, California. You'll find me that way. You can also find me via my podcast, Accessible Housing Matters. We have a web page, I have a Google page, I have a Facebook page, I have a LinkedIn identity there. And so you can easily get my email address. You can always email me directly too, Stephen at accessiblehousingmatters.com.
And I'll
And
have
they can
links to
always
that down below.
reach
So
out to
in
you, Ken.
Yep.
If they reach out to you, you can send them my way too.
That too, yeah. And there'll be links. There'll be links in the description of the podcast. So if people need to find them, they can find them there as well. There'll be some links just so they can find you and your podcast, which is awesome. It
Thank
really
you.
is. Take a listen to that as well. So I want to thank you so much, Stephen, for coming on and being a guest and talking about
Oh,
some very, very, very important topics about housing. Some stuff that I don't think enough people think about. I never had really thought about it in a broader sense until I first talked to you. And so, thank you for broadening my own mind.
well, thank you so much for having me as a guest, and thank you for doing your podcast. I think the more we talk about some of these issues, which are difficult, the more we educate each other and educate the audiences and help all of us to improve. So
Yeah,
thank you for doing your podcast and allowing me to be a guest on it. Thank
my
you.
pleasure. My pleasure. This has been the Disabling My Ability podcast. I am your host, Ken Meeker, and each week I have a new guest that I bring on where we discuss living with a disability, trying to get rid of the shame and stigma that is associated with living with a disability. And I hope you will all subscribe and tune in each week. Thank you so much.